Welcome back to Lecture 5 in our series on World War II. If you remember from our last lecture, we ended with the German invasion and onslaught in Western Europe. We saw that Germany first invaded Poland, then took a break, what was known as the Phony War, from October 1939 to April 1940, or the Sitzkrieg in German. And then in April of 1940, Hitler unleashes what we call the Dogs of War. That is, again, this new style of warfare based on extremely rapid advances using airplanes to soften up enemy defenses, followed by tanks, followed by infantry. Highly successful. The nations of Western Europe were completely unprepared for this type of war, and they fell very quickly in rapid succession. So after that, in the summer of 1940, Hitler turns his attentions to Great Britain. Now, not having a great navy, Hitler was unable to ferry his troops across the English Channel, so he relied on aerial warfare, something we're going to see an awful lot of used in World War II and right down to today. So you might ask, well, what is the United States doing at this time? And at this point in time, again, the United States is going to stick to its neutrality policies. And although Roosevelt is going to work in 1940 to get the Congress to agree to some new defense spending measures in what was called a military preparedness campaign. Let's prepare the United States for the eventuality of war, and therefore Roosevelt gets Congress to appropriate, that is, spend up to $1 billion in defense spending to help build up the American military machine, which was in pretty sorry shape by 1940. Not having fought since 1918, World War I. Congress is also going to pass a draft, that is selective service, whereby males in a certain age group have to register with the government and with the War Department in the eventuality of war. And this was the first peacetime draft in the history of the United States. And many of you may have found that draft cards, selective service cards for the Veterans Project that we're doing. And here you see pictured Jeeps coming off a production line and munitions shells being prepared by a female worker. So, and then I guess the big question was that people were asking in the United States, to what extent did Hitler pose a threat to the United States? After all, the United States has the Atlantic Ocean that separates it from Europe, and as we already noted, Hitler did not have a large navy, though the Nazis and the Germans had developed the use of submarines, very effective, though they didn't have lots and lots of them. So the big question was Germany really a threat to the United States? And I think most Americans did not like Hitler, didn't like what he stood for, what he was doing, yet they didn't really see Hitler as a direct threat to them and to our national security. So let's move forward. President Roosevelt, however, is working with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, going to try to extend aid to Great Britain. And the idea was that Britain was the first line of defense for the United States. So if we could keep the war in Europe across the Atlantic, that would be in the best interest of the United States. So therefore, Roosevelt's looking for different ways to help England. And one of the things he comes up with was this idea of swapping U.S. destroyers that were no longer in use. And you can see them in the picture there on the right. Now the photo is grainy, but there were over 50 destroyers that were out of use, decommissioned, if you will. And the idea was, well, let's give them to Britain. And in return, the United States was going to acquire, in the map that you see down there, a series of bases, military installations throughout the Caribbean. And you can see from Key West to Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, etc., the Virgin Islands, these territories now that the United States is going to acquire in this exchange. Now, Britain needed these destroyers so that it could safely escort convoys of supplies that Britain was purchasing using cash and carry from the United States back to England. So the destroyers were going to be very vital in the British war effort. So let's go back to the battle for Britain. As I already mentioned in a previous slide, the Germans are going to launch, and you can see here in the map on the right, series of airstrikes trying to knock out the English, and they're going to target English military installations and bases, but then increasingly the Germans are going to begin to target English civilian areas, so English cities, towns, and in particular we see London in yellow. And so Germany is simply going to rain down on these cities, these unprotected cities, full of civilians, of course, bombs trying to disrupt life, kill civilians, and then take away the sort of the morale of the English people. That is, the desire to stand up and fight was going to, that was the goal of these bombings. And we already saw in a previous lecture the idea of aerial warfare that the Japanese unleashed on the Chinese, and as well the Germans unleashed on the Spanish during the Spanish Civil War at Guernica. So we see that this is again going to be what we might call 20th century warfare, war from the air. So the Germans are unsuccessful. The British are able to repel the Germans with their own air force. The Royal Air Force fought nobly and bravely. And also another technological innovation, radar comes into existence. And so the English are able to set up radar installations along their coast on the English Channel that allows English pilots to know when and where the German planes are coming, so that they were able to intercept them and cut them off before they could drop all of their bombs on English cities. The other thing that happens in 1940 is President Roosevelt runs for a third term and wins, and you can see the newspaper headline down below. That had never happened before. President Washington, our first president, set what was known as the precedent, that is the model to follow of 2 terms for a president, though nothing in the Constitution said a president could not run for a third term. FDR decides to, in fact, run for a third term, and in large part he receives the overwhelming support of the American public. I think he won 42 out of 50 states in the November 1940 election because of the war, the threat of war. And people decided that at this point we should not change a commander-in-chief and their president with this looming threat. So Roosevelt wins re-election. And at this point, I think something interesting happens. So Britain defeats Germany in what is known as the Battle for Britain, and this is a big victory for the British. However, it left the British drained. They no longer had any cash reserves. They're out of arms and planes and munitions that they need to continue the fight against Hitler. So at this point, English Prime Minister Winston Churchill tells Roosevelt, in fact, in communications, that the Brits could no longer afford to buy weapons from the U.S. And Churchill makes a passionate pitch and plea for more help from the United States. And in a radio, let me go to this, in a fireside chat, Roosevelt is going to, in fact, come up with this idea, or his advisors for him, of a Lend-Lease. And he gets Congress, in particular the House, to pass or to introduce a bill known as House Resolution 1776. That number is not ironic. You'll notice the year 1776, the year of our independence from Great Britain. So history comes full circle. And in this bill, the United States promises to provide all sorts of military assistance and equipment to then England and France, its ally, free of charge. And this is going to be a major shift in U.S. policy. Now, Roosevelt is a very good speaker. He spoke by radio to the American public, reaching into their homes to address them using the technology of his time, something like, we might say, Twitter, social media today. And Roosevelt comes up with this clever analogy, and you can see there at the bottom this picture of Roosevelt speaking into a mic, and then in the background a burning building, and then there's a hose. And he says, look, say your neighbor's house catches fire. Your neighbor comes over and says, hey, would you lend me your garden hose so I can put out the fire? And what do? I mean, do you sit there and watch your neighbor's house burn with the risk that the fire may spread to your house? And the answer, according to Roosevelt, and I think everybody plainly understands, no. You loan your neighbor your hose, and you don't worry about what's going to happen to the hose. That is, it's going to get beat up, damaged, or destroyed. You simply want the fire to be put out. And so that was the idea of Lend-Lease. Congress passes this bill after vigorous debate, and there was a lot of opposition in Congress to this type of policy whereby the United States is essentially providing all the weapons and assistance to England and France, and that sort of gets us involved in the war. That is, we're no longer neutral in this case. We're clearly supporting the English and the French against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And that was the point. And later, this Lend-Lease aid was going to be provided to China as it attempted to hold off and hold back the Japanese. So this bill passes, and Lend-Lease becomes the new policy of the United States. And we unofficially then join the war. Now, I want to back up a slide. I forgot to mention this. Roosevelt wins election. He's inaugurated to the presidency again for the third term in January of 1941. And he delivers a speech, the State of the Union speech for 1941, and it's called the Four Freedoms speech. And in this speech, Roosevelt sort of articulates, that is, he announces his vision for the world, and he comes up with a phrase called the Four Freedoms, and that is the United States really represents and stands for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, that is misery, economic misery, not having food, etc. So you see in the picture there this great big turkey being served on a platter at Thanksgiving. And so we don't want to go without food and the basic necessities of life. And we also believe in freedom from fear, that nobody should live a life in which they're afraid, afraid for their existence, afraid for their very being, afraid for their identity. And so that the United States, in this speech, Roosevelt kind of captures a lot of what the United States stands for. And he says, look, this is what we want to see in place throughout the world. So, in fact, then the speech becomes known as sort of the United Nations speech. That is, all of the allies of England, France, and the United States, the United Nations, are going to stand up and stand together against Nazi fascist tyranny and dictatorship in support of these four freedoms. Now, later when we begin to look at the Cold War after World War II, we have to remember that the Soviet Union was also one of our allies and part of the United Nations. But the Soviet Union was led by a brutal dictator and was a communist style regime. So it's rather interesting what happens here. But nonetheless, this is the situation in early 1941. So let me just run back forward to this last slide, and we'll end the lecture here. So Roosevelt, after the passage of Lend-Lease in the spring of 1941, has his military advisors, and you can see a picture there of U.S. military advisors meeting with British military advisors, and they create a military strategy, that is war plans. And you can see the newspaper kind of in big, bold headlines, capturing this moment in which the United States and Great Britain begin to work together to map out a strategy for what really, I guess, Roosevelt and the military understood was a looming and impending war. And the idea was that Germany needed to be defeated first, and then second, Japan. So Germany first, Japan second. This was known as the Rainbow Five Plan, later the ABC-1 plan. And that's really something that, is going to, again, suggest Roosevelt sees that the United States is not going to be able to stay out of this war. We're going to have to get involved, and therefore the idea of preparedness, something that we saw in an earlier slide, that the United States, and he felt that Roosevelt felt that his job as president and also commander-in-chief was to prepare the nation for war. And this is the last slide of this lecture. So in August of 1941, Roosevelt travels up to Newfoundland, Canada, and he meets with Prime Minister Churchill. And they issue what's known as the Atlantic Charter. And it really, again, is a statement now. It's a joint statement, unlike the United Nations speech. It's a joint statement of what the United States and Britain stand for in the world. And it really takes Woodrow Wilson's points from the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I, and it kind of represents them, repackages them, represents them to the world. So the United States and Britain have a clear idea and mission. Okay, thank you, and we'll pick up the next time.